By December of 1776, the American Revolution was pretty much over. The glorious cause, the bold declaration of a new nation, was freezing to death in the snows of New Jersey. A string of crushing, humiliating defeats had left George Washington's Continental Army in tatters. They were a phantom force, a ghost of an army, hunted across the countryside by the most powerful military machine on earth. Their enlistments were set to expire on New Year's Eve. Hope was a dwindling ember, and the dream of independence was about to be extinguished forever. And yet, in this darkest hour, with the fate of unborn millions hanging by a thread, one man refused to surrender. One man, driven by what he called a dire necessity, cooked up a plan so audacious, so utterly improbable, that it would either save the revolution or drown it in the icy waters of the Delaware River. This is the story of how George Washington, through sheer force of will, turned the tide of history and snatched freedom from the brink of absolute collapse. To really understand the miracle of what happened that Christmas in 1776, you first have to understand the catastrophe that came before it. The year had started with a glimmer of hope. In March, Washington's army had forced the British to evacuate Boston, a stunning early victory that sent waves of confidence through the colonies. But that confidence was a fleeting illusion. The full might of the British Empire was about to descend. In the summer, the hammer fell. A massive British armada, the largest expeditionary force of the 18th century, appeared off the coast of New York. We're talking a fleet of nearly 400 ships and an army of about 32,000 professional British and Hessian soldiers, a force designed to crush the rebellion in a single, overwhelming campaign. Washington, trying to defend New York, was faced with an impossible task. His army was a collection of farmers, merchants, and volunteers, badly equipped and with little to no training in conventional warfare. The Battle of Long Island in August was a disaster. The Americans were outflanked, outfought, and routed. Only a desperate, fog-shrouded evacuation saved the army from being wiped out completely. What followed was just a cascade of defeats. Kip's Bay, where American militia fled in terror, much to Washington's fury. The Battle of White Plains, another loss. The fall of Fort Washington in November was the final, devastating blow, resulting in the capture of nearly 3,000 American soldiers. What began next wasn't a battle, but a desperate flight for survival, the Great Retreat across New Jersey. Chased by General Charles Cornwallis's relentless army, Washington's forces just melted away. Soldiers, their summer enlistments over, simply walked home. Others, sick and starving, deserted into the frozen woods. The army that had numbered nearly 20,000 in New York had dwindled to just a few thousand haggard men. They were, as one observer noted, greatly harassed and fatigued, frequently without rest, covering, or provision. They left bloody footprints in the snow from their shoeless feet. It was a picture of utter despair. The crisis wasn't just on the battlefield, it was a crisis of faith. Congress, terrified the British would capture the capital, fled Philadelphia for Baltimore. Loyalists, who had been quiet, now openly supported the Crown, convinced the rebellion was finished. Even in the Army's high command, whispers of doubt grew louder. General Charles Lee, Washington's second-in-command, openly questioned his leader's abilities in letters, sowing dissent and dragging his feet on reinforcing the beleaguered commander. Washington felt the immense pressure, writing in a private letter, "The reflection upon my situation and that of this army produces many an uneasy hour when all around me are wrapped in sleep." He knew the very soul of the revolution was at stake. And it was here that he found an unlikely ally, not in a general, but in a writer. Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense, had been marching with the retreating army. On December 19th, he published the first of a new series of pamphlets, The American Crisis. Its opening words were like a thunderclap, a direct challenge to the despair that had taken root. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Washington was so moved that he ordered Paine's words read aloud to his shivering, exhausted troops. In the flickering firelight of their desperate camps on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, these words became a lifeline. They reminded the men what they were fighting for. They weren't just soldiers. They were the last defense of an idea. Paine's words didn't give them food or shoes, but they gave them something just as vital: resolve. But resolve alone couldn't stop the clock. A hard deadline was coming. December 31st, 1776. On that day, the enlistments of most of his remaining soldiers would expire. The Continental Army would simply cease to exist. The British, settled comfortably in their winter quarters across New Jersey, knew this. All they had to do was wait. The revolution would die not with a bang, but with a whimper, as men just packed up and went home. Washington knew he had one last chance. He couldn't wait. He had to act. He had to risk everything on a single roll of the dice. Across the Delaware River, in the town of Trenton, sat a garrison of about 1,400 Hessian mercenaries. These were professional German soldiers hired by the British, famous for their discipline and ferocity. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, was a veteran of European wars, confident and dismissive of the rebel army. He'd been warned of a possible attack, but constant harassment by local militia had worn his men down, and the idea of a major assault by Washington's broken army just seemed ridiculous. Washington, however, saw an opportunity. An isolated outpost, a symbol of the foreign power they were trying to overthrow. Attacking it was a desperate gamble. Failure would mean the absolute end. But a victory could change everything. It could reignite the cause. He later wrote that dire necessity was his only justification for such a monumental risk. The plan he came up with was breathtaking in its audacity and complexity. It wasn't just one crossing, but a coordinated, three-pronged attack. One force under General James Ewing would cross directly at Trenton to block the Hessians' escape south. A second, larger force under Colonel John Cadwalader would cross further south to create a diversion and stop British reinforcements. And the main force, 2,400 men under Washington's personal command, would cross the river 9 miles north of Trenton at a place called McConkey's Ferry. They would then march south in 2 columns and hit the town from different directions before dawn. The password for the night was simple, stark, and absolute: victory or death. There was no middle ground. This was their situation in 3 words: success or utter ruin. The logistics were a nightmare. The crossing was set to begin on Christmas night, December 25th, and continue into the early hours of the 26th, using the holiday to enhance the element of surprise. But a vicious nor'easter, a powerful winter storm, descended on them. The river, already dangerous, became choked with huge floating blocks of ice. The wind howled, pelting the men with freezing rain, sleet, and snow. Washington put his chief of artillery, the formidable Henry Knox, in charge of the crossing. Knox, a 250-pound former bookseller with a booming voice, was a logistical genius. He had to get not just men, but horses and 18 heavy cannons across the churning, icy water. They used a collection of sturdy Durham boats, designed for hauling iron ore, which Washington had cleverly secured. These were guided by the expert hands of Colonel John Glover's regiment of Marblehead Mariners, fishermen from Massachusetts, who were perhaps the only men in the colonies who could pull off such a feat under these conditions. The process was painfully slow. The storm was worse than anyone expected. Ice jams formed, threatening to crush the boats. Washington, wrapped in his cloak, stood on the Pennsylvania bank, a stoic figure of calm resolve, watching his army trickle across. He was among the first to cross, setting up a perimeter on the New Jersey side. But his complex plan was already falling apart. The brutal storm was too much for the other 2 prongs of the attack. Both Ewing and Cadwalader decided the crossing was impossible and called it off. Neither of them made it across the river. Washington was now on his own. His force was completely isolated, with no support and no diversion. Total surprise was his only remaining advantage. The crossing, which Washington had hoped to finish by midnight, was more than 3 hours behind schedule. Dawn was coming, and they still had a long march ahead. A council of war was held on the frozen Jersey shore. Some officers, seeing the delays and knowing the other forces hadn't made it, advised calling off the attack. Retreat was the safe option, but Washington knew that retreat was its own kind of defeat. The morale of his men, already so fragile, might shatter for good. He made his decision. They would push on. The march to Trenton began. The 9-mile march south was an ordeal. The freezing storm raged on. Men, many with rags wrapped around their feet instead of boots, slipped and fell on the icy roads. 2 soldiers literally froze to death on the march. Yet, they pressed on, their footsteps muffled by the snow. The password victory or death wasn't just a phrase. It was the silent promise they made to each other with every agonizing step. As they neared Trenton, Washington split his force as planned. One column, under General Nathaniel Greene, would attack from the north, while the other, under General John Sullivan, would swing around and attack from the west. The surprise was absolute, and contrary to the popular myth, the Hessians weren't all drunk from Christmas celebrations. They were exhausted from constant patrols. Their commander, Colonel Rahl, had fatally dismissed a warning from a local farmer earlier that evening, reportedly tucking the unread note into his pocket during a card game. When the attack began around 8 a.m., with the thunder of Henry Knox's cannons at the head of the main streets, the garrison was caught completely off guard. The battle was short and decisive. American artillery swept the streets, preventing the Hessians from forming up. The 2 American columns slammed into the town from opposite ends, trapping the garrison. Colonel Rahl, trying to rally his men, was mortally wounded. Leaderless and surrounded, the Hessians' discipline broke. Within an hour, it was over. The results were stunning. The Americans had suffered only a handful of wounded, plus the 2 men who had frozen on the march. The Hessians, on the other hand, had over 20 killed, around 90 wounded, and nearly 900 captured. Washington's army, the army the British thought was defeated, had destroyed an entire garrison of professional soldiers and captured all their supplies. After the battle, Washington visited the dying Colonel Rahl and promised that the captured men would be treated humanely. The military value of Trenton was huge, but its psychological impact was immeasurable. It was a thunderbolt that electrified the colonies. Hope, nearly extinguished, was reborn. The victory proved that the Continental Army could stand up to European professionals and win, renewing confidence in Washington's leadership. But Washington knew one victory wasn't enough. On December 30th, he led his army back across the Delaware and reoccupied Trenton. This was an open challenge to the British. He even persuaded many men whose enlistments were about to expire to stay on for 6 more weeks, offering them a hard-money bounty. The British response was swift. General Cornwallis marched south from Princeton with 8,000 troops, determined to bag the old fox. On January 2, 1777, Cornwallis's army arrived at Trenton. Washington's smaller force was now trapped, their backs to the Delaware River. Cornwallis, confident he had them cornered, decided to wait until morning to deliver the final blow. That night, Washington presented a plan even more daring than the attack on Trenton. Instead of fighting a suicidal battle, they would slip away in the night. They left their campfires burning brightly to fool the British, muffled their cannon wheels with cloth, and took a little-known back road to march north and attack the British garrison at Princeton. It was a stroke of genius. At dawn on January 3rd, Cornwallis awoke to find his enemy had vanished. By then, Washington's army was already on the outskirts of Princeton. The Battle of Princeton wasn't as clean as Trenton. An American advance force under General Hugh Mercer, a close friend of Washington's, was overrun, and Mercer was mortally wounded. The American line began to break. The Revolution was once again hanging by a thread. And then George Washington himself rode onto the field. In an act of unbelievable personal courage, he galloped his horse directly between his fleeing men and the advancing British regulars, who were only about 30 yards away. He sat there, a clear target, rallying his troops. Both sides fired. When the smoke cleared, Washington was untouched, calmly leading the charge. His sheer presence turned terror into courage. The American line reformed, charged, and broke the British, securing another stunning victory. Those 10 crucial days, between December 25, 1776, and January 3, 1777, completely transformed the American Revolution. 2 stunning victories forced the British to pull back from most of New Jersey, saving Philadelphia. The Continental Army had survived. More than that, it had been reborn. Recruits began to fill the ranks again, and the entire nation found a renewed sense of purpose. But this wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of one man's leadership, George Washington. His leadership wasn't just about battlefield tactics. It was about something deeper. It was about integrity, the character that earned the unwavering trust of his men. It was about vision, the ability to see a path forward when everyone else saw only defeat. And above all, it was about resilience. When the cause was on the verge of collapse, when the army was disintegrating, when his own officers were losing faith, Washington refused to break. He absorbed the despair of an entire nation and forged it into a weapon. He risked everything, not for personal glory, but because he understood what was at stake. As he had written, the fate of unborn millions depended on them. The man who rode between the firing lines at Princeton, who crossed the icy Delaware, who held a dying army together with his own character, was more than a general. He became the living embodiment of the Revolution itself, unyielding, courageous, and absolutely determined to be free. In the darkest hour of 1776, it was George Washington who grabbed the flickering candle of American liberty and shielded it from the storm, ensuring its light would one day illuminate the world. If you found this story of leadership and revolution compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that shaped our world. And let us know in the comments below, what moment from the American Revolution inspires you the most? Thanks for watching.